The map in your hand is a lie, not a mistake, not a product of primitive surveying. It is a deliberate, calculated omission. If you look at the 1531 Oron's Finet map, you see a landmass at the bottom of the world that shouldn't exist according to the history we were taught in elementary school. It shows mountains, it shows river systems, it shows a topography that matches the subglacial terrain discovered by modern radar centuries later. Ask yourself how a Renaissance cartographer knew the shape of the rock beneath 2 miles of ice. We are told the great southern continent was a myth until the 19th century, a placeholder for Terra Australis Incognita. But the precision of the coastline suggests something else, not an unknown land, a remembered one. What if the ice isn't a natural geological epoch? What if the ice is a shroud? We begin with a single jagged anomaly, the Piri Reis map. Drawn in 1513, it depicts the Queen Maud land coast of Antarctica free of ice. The official narrative claims this is merely a coincidental resemblance to South America, but look closer at the longitudinal accuracy. Look at the specific placement of islands that were only confirmed in the 1950s. The institutional gatekeeping of our history requires us to believe these were lucky guesses. They want us to believe that the most sophisticated civilization to ever walk the earth simply forgot to leave a paper trail. But the trail isn't on paper. It is in the architecture of our very reality. It is in the load distribution of cathedrals that mirror the grand halls of the lost north. It is in the magnetic anomalies that flicker like a dying pulse beneath the Ross ice shelf. We are looking for Tartaria, that vast, erased empire of the steppes, but we have been looking in the wrong direction. We have been looking at the maps they gave us. We should have been looking at the maps they hid. Consider the silence of the 1840s, a decade of sudden, frantic exploration. Why did every major power, the British, the French, the Americans, suddenly find the funding to charge into the deadliest environment on the planet? They tell us it was for seals. They tell us it was for whale oil. They tell us it was for the glory of the flag. Not this, not that, something else. They were looking for the edge. They were looking for the remnants of the grand Tartarian infrastructure that had been flash frozen in a cataclysm we are no longer permitted to name. If you study the logs of these early explorers, you find references to basaltic pillars and geometric formations that were later scrubbed from the official published accounts. What if the mountains they described were actually the apexes of buried spires? The scale of the erasure is breathtaking. To hide a continent, you must first rewrite the stars. You must change the way we perceive time itself. The introduction of the Gregorian calendar and the systematic destruction of Tartarian genealogical records served one purpose: to disconnect us from the global energy grid that once spanned from the Gobi Desert to the Antarctic Circle. Ask yourself why the world's most powerful nations signed the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. Why is this the only piece of land on Earth where there is no sovereignty, no private ownership, and no independent exploration? It is not to protect the penguins. It is to protect the secret of the ice. They call it a wilderness. We should call it a crime scene. The ice is not a climate. It is a weapon of institutional erasure. The pattern repeats across every meridian. If you look at the star forts of the northern hemisphere, you see a specific resonant geometry designed for the harvest of atmospheric electricity. These are not defensive structures. No general would build a fort with thousands of feet of unnecessary decorative masonry and perfect fractal symmetry just to deflect cannonballs. They were nodes. Now, project that same geometry onto the southern pole. What if the South Pole is not a geographic point, but a central terminal? The Tartarian Empire was not a nation-state, it was a global technological framework. When the Great Reset occurred, the event the theoreticians call the Mud Flood, the centres of power were physically buried. In the north, they were covered in soil and renamed as foundations for neoclassical post offices. In the south, the Supreme was more absolute. They used the elements, they used the cold, they used the very water of the world to build a crystalline prison over the administrative heart of the old world. What if the Ice Age is a fabrication to explain away the sudden appearance of the glaciers that drowned the Tartarian capital? Think about the energy required to flash freeze a continent. Think about the technological capability of a civilization that could manipulate the jet stream to create a permanent frost curtain. We are told the ice has been there for millions of years, but the core samples tell a different story, one of a sudden violent deposition, not a slow accumulation, a burial. Everything we know about load distribution in modern engineering is a pale shadow of the Tartarian understanding of frequency. They didn't build with mortar, they built with vibration. This is why the ruins we find in the forbidden zones of the Antarctic periphery don't look like ruins. They look like geological formations. The fingers of rock rising from the ice are the calcified remains of atmospheric resonators. When the power was cut, the molecular structure of the buildings began to fail, bonding with the rising tide of salt and silt. Look at the photographs from the 1929 Bird expedition. Before the heavy censorship of the Cold War era began, the images showed something different. They showed horizons that were too straight to be natural. They showed tunnels that were too circular to be glacial. Why was Admiral Byrd so obsessed with the idea of a land beyond the pole? He wasn't talking about another planet. He was talking about the part of our world that hadn't been whitewashed yet. What if Tartaria didn't just exist in the east? What if it was the central pillar of a world that was once much larger than the one we are allowed to navigate? Ask yourself why every flight path in the southern hemisphere is diverted. Ask yourself why the flat earth debate is so heavily promoted as a controlled opposition, to make any questioning of Antarctic geography look like madness. Not a sphere, not a plane, a controlled territory. Institutional gatekeeping relies on the fragmentation of knowledge. The historian doesn't talk to the geologist. The geologist doesn't talk to the electrical engineer. If they did, they would realize that the natural magnetic field of the Earth is being artificially maintained by the buried ruins at the poles. The Tartarians used the magnetic flux of the planet to power a world without wires, without bills, and without scarcity. This is the forbidden knowledge. This is why they had to be erased. A society that has free energy cannot be controlled. A society that knows its true history cannot be enslaved. To keep us in the dark, they had to put the world on ice. Not a disaster, not a natural cycle, a coup d'etat against the human race. Look at the research stations littered across the Antarctic plateau. They are not laboratories, they are listening posts. They are guarding the vents. They are monitoring the slow, inevitable thawing of a history they can no longer contain. What if the melting of the ice caps isn't a tragedy of the modern age, but a return of the suppressed? What if the climate crisis is actually a desperate attempt to find a way to refreeze the evidence before the spires of the old world break the surface? We are taught that the Victorian era was a time of great discovery. In reality, it was a time of great looting. The expeditions to the south were not looking for new lands. They were looking for the keys to the old ones. They were excavating the technology that would later be rebranded as modern inventions. the radio, the light bulb, the internal combustion engine, all of it was reverse engineered from the artifacts found in the thawing edges of the Tartarian southern rim. This is why the late 19th century saw such a sudden vertical spike in technological advancement. It wasn't human genius, it was a salvage operation. And to keep the secret of the salvage, they had to create a narrative of primitive ancestors. They had to make us believe we were the pinnacle of evolution, so we wouldn't look back and realize we are actually living in the ruins of a much higher state of being, not progress, not evolution, a managed decline. Ask yourself why the architecture of 1890 looks more sophisticated than the architecture of 1990. Ask yourself why we can no longer build the way they did. The knowledge was lost because the source was buried in the ice. The maps of the 16th century frequently show an island called Frisland or High Brazil in the North Atlantic and a massive populated landmass in the south. Modern scholars call these phantom islands. They claim they were myths or mapping errors. But how do you accidentally map a coastline with the accuracy of a GPS? You don't. You map what you see. The islands didn't disappear because of rising sea levels. They were hidden by the same atmospheric manipulation that locked the south in ice. The fog of war is not just a metaphor, it is a literal technique of geographic erasure. If you control the perception of the horizon, you control the extent of the world. What if the world we see is only a fraction of the land available to us? What if the ice wall is not the edge of the world, but the border of our cage? The Tartarians moved freely between the continents because they understood the magnetic pathways. They didn't use ships of wood and sail. They used the very currents of the Earth's aether. This is why there are no ruts in the roads of the ancient world. They didn't need them. Consider the deep state not as a political entity, but as a chronological one. The people in power today are the direct descendants of the families who oversaw the Great Reset. They are the ones who managed the transition from the Tartarian free energy world to the hydrocarbon slave world. They are the ones who turned the archives into classified information. Every time you pay a power bill, you are paying a tax to the people who hid the truth. Every time you fill a gas tank, you are funding the erasure of your own heritage. The ice in Antarctica is the physical manifestation of our collective amnesia. It is a dense, cold weight pressing down on the memory of who we are and what we are capable of. Not a glacier, not a shelf, a tombstone. And on that tombstone, they have written a false history of primitive nomads and slow-moving centuries. But the stone is beginning to crack. The heat is rising, not from the sun, but from the friction of the truth trying to break free. The staccato beat of the modern world is designed to keep you from noticing the rhythm of the old one. We live in a world of planned obsolescence, of flickering screens and disposable things. The Tartarians built for eternity. Their structures were designed to resonate with the Schumann resonance of the earth, creating a state of permanent health and abundance. This is why the hospitals of the 19th century were built in the shells of old Tartarian energy centers. They weren't curing diseases. They were trying to figure out how the buildings used to heal the people inside them. When they couldn't figure it out, they turned the buildings into prisons and asylums. They turned the places of light into places of darkness. They did the same thing to the south. They took the most beautiful, vibrant part of the world and turned it into a wasteland of white noise. What if the aurora australis is not a solar phenomenon, but the leaking radiation of the buried Tartarian grid? What if the hole in the ozone was actually a doorway. Ask yourself what you would do if you found out that everything you were taught about the history of the world was a lie, designed to keep you in a state of perpetual debt. What if the progress of the last 200 years was actually a slow, painful crawl out of a hole we were thrown into? The mystery of Tartaria and the mystery of Antarctica are the same mystery. One is the name of the victim, and the other is the location of the body. We are standing on the edge of a revelation that will change the meaning of being human, but they won't let it happen easily. They will use the ice. They will use the fear. They will use the institutional gatekeepers to tell you that you are seeing ghosts, but ghosts don't leave geometric shadows under the snow. Ghosts don't have magnetic signatures that can be seen from space. Not ghosts, not myths. A civilization. Our civilization, buried in the ice and waiting for the thaw. What if the end of the world is not something to be feared, but the moment the ice finally melts and we see what was there all along? Not a void, not a desert, a home, an empire, a memory. The stratigraphic record of the southern ice is a curated archive of silence. If you examine the core samples extracted by the Vostok station, you are presented with a timeline that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. They speak of atmospheric composition, of trapped carbon, of volcanic ash. But ask yourself why the raw data is never released to independent laboratories. Why is the peer review process for Antarctic glaciology guarded by the same military-industrial complexes that manage our satellite surveillance? The truth is that the layers of ice are not years, they are events. Each stratum represents a pulse of artificial cooling used to suppress the subterranean heat of the Tartarian thermal plants that still hum beneath the bedrock. The load distribution of the entire continent has been altered by the sheer weight of this manufactured permafrost, not a natural accumulation, not a slow descent into a deep freeze, a flash saturation. When the Tartarian Empire was dismantled in the mid-19th century, the victors faced a problem. How do you hide a global power source that draws directly from the ionosphere? You don't dismantle it, you insulate it. You bury it under a substance that blocks frequency and discourages exploration. You turn the garden of the world into a restricted laboratory of cold. Look at the mid-century architecture of the global south, the grand, sprawling colonial government buildings in Buenos Aires, Cape Town, and Melbourne. They possess a scale and a masonry technique that defies the primitive tools of the settlers who supposedly built them. They are oversized, they are resonant, they feature copper domes and iron finials that serve no structural purpose in a world of steam and coal. These were the relay stations for the Antarctic hub. The explorers like Shackleton and Scott were not pioneers. They were technicians sent to sever the lines. They were the cleanup crew for a civilization that had been decapitated. In their diaries, they speak of the Great Barrier as if it were a conscious entity, an obstacle that seemed to rebuild itself overnight. What if the barrier wasn't just ice? What if it was a field? A perimeter established to ensure that the new world order could proceed without the interference of the old world's energy. They called it the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. We should call it the Great Disconnection. The institutional erasure required that we view the South as a dead space, a void where nothing has ever lived and nothing can ever grow. But the soil beneath the ice is rich with the pollen of tropical plants that were living and breathing only centuries ago, not millions of years, centuries. The map is the territory, but only if you are allowed to see the whole map. Consider the Mercator projection, the standard for our schools and our navigation. It distorts the poles, stretching them into infinity, making the Arctic and Antarctic look like peripheral smears rather than central anchors. This is a psychological operation disguised as cartography. It forces the mind to prioritize the middle of the world, where the controlled nations reside, while marginalizing the areas where the true machinery of the earth is located. The Tartarians did not use Mercator. Their maps were azimuthal, equidistant, centering the North Pole and showing the world as a contained system of concentric rings. In this view, Antarctica is not a point at the bottom. It is a ring that encompasses us, not a continent, a boundary. And beyond that boundary lies the land beyond the pole that Admiral Byrd spoke of with such hushed reverence. What if the Tartarian Empire wasn't just destroyed? What if it was forced to retreat? What if the ice is the only thing keeping the two worlds apart? Ask yourself why every modern satellite image of the poles is stitched together with a black hole in the center. They tell us it's a coordinate glitch, not a glitch, a blind spot. Institutional gatekeeping functions through the weaponization of ridicule. If you suggest that the history of the 19th century is a fabrication, you are labelled a revisionist. If you suggest that the geography of the earth is being hidden, you are labelled a conspirator. But look at the evidence of the world's fairs between 1850 and 1915. These were not celebrations of progress. They were burn-offs of Tartarian infrastructure. Massive, magnificent cities of stone and light were built in 8 months, only to be demolished as temporary structures. They were showing the public what they had lost, while telling them it was what they had just invented. And at the centre of every one of these fairs was an exhibit on the unexplored regions. They were conditioning the masses to accept the new boundaries of the world. They were teaching us to look at the ruins of our masters and see the progress of our peers. The scale of the lie is so vast that the mind instinctively rejects it. It is easier to believe in 1,000,000 years of ice than in 100 years of deception. But the ice is melting, the ground is shifting, and the load distribution of the narrative is beginning to fail under the weight of the truth. Think about the technical terms they use to describe the Antarctic landscape. Nunataks, moraines, eskers. These are labels used to naturalize what is artificial. A nunatak is often just the peak of a cathedral that has been ground down by the slow movement of the glacial shield. A moraine is the rubble of a city pushed into a heap by a natural force that was actually a directed energy event. We are looking at a battlefield and calling it a wilderness. The skeptics will ask for the bodies. Where are the millions who lived in this Tartarian paradise? They are in the silt. They are in the mud of the mud flood that preceded the freezing. They are the carbon signatures that the scientists claim are from ancient forest fires. Not fires, a global incineration of the old record. What if the ozone hole was actually the result of the atmosphere reacting to the reactivation of an ancient Tartarian defense array? What if the warming, we are told, is our fault, is actually the Earth trying to heal itself by shedding the cold skin that was forced upon it? The rhythm of the investigation leads us to the same conclusion. We are a species with amnesia, living in a house we didn't build, using tools we don't understand. The elites who rule from the shadows are not geniuses, they are squatters. They are living in the upper floors of the Tartarian mansion while keeping us locked in the basement, telling us that the sun doesn't exist and the world is made of concrete and debt. But the basement is flooding. The water is coming from the south. The ice is giving up its secrets. Not this year, not next year, soon. The institutional erasure is failing because the Earth itself refuses to forget. The magnetic anomalies are growing stronger. The aurora is appearing in places it shouldn't be. The grid is waking up. Ask yourself what happens to a world built on the suppression of energy when that energy can no longer be suppressed. What happens to the lie when the ice turns back into water? The history we are given is a linear progression from primitive to advanced. This is a fundamental inversion of the truth. We are in a state of entropy. We are the scavengers of a high-tech past. The load distribution of our current society is precarious because it is built on the extraction of dead things, oil, coal, gas, rather than the harvest of living frequencies. The Tartarians understood that the earth is a capacitor. They knew that the relationship between the ground and the sky is a source of infinite power. They built their cities to tap into this potential, and when the reset happened, the first thing the usurpers did was ground the system. They literally buried the electrodes in ice and mud. They cut the wires and called it enlightenment. They gave us the light bulb and took away the light. They gave us the airplane and took away the world beyond the horizon. What if the aliens that the government is suddenly so keen to discuss are not from another planet? What if they are the survivors of the Tartarian collapse, returning from the hidden lands beyond the Antarctic ring? What if the UFOs are just the standard transport vehicles of the previous era, finally coming back online as the magnetic dampeners in the south begin to fail? The narrative of extraterrestrials is the perfect cover for extraterritorials. It keeps us looking at the sky so we don't look at the maps. It keeps us focused on the alien, other, so we don't recognize our own ancestors. Not them. Us. Something else. A continuity of human presence that has been surgically removed from our collective consciousness. We must become investigative essayists of our own reality. We must look at the anomalies not as glitches, but as clues. The blood falls of Antarctica, red water pouring from a glacier, is not just iron oxide. It is a biological signature of a subterranean ecosystem that was never meant to be frozen. The pyramids of the Ellsworth Mountains are not natural peaks. They are too perfect. Their angles are too precise. They align with the stars in a way that geology cannot explain. They are the anchors of the southern grid, and they are starting to vibrate again. You can hear it in the low frequency hum that is being reported by people all over the world. It's not the Taos hum, it's the sound of the engines starting up. The institutional gatekeepers are scrambling. They are building more research stations. They are passing more environmental regulations. They are trying to tighten the lid on a boiling pot. Ask yourself why the world is so obsessed with sustainability all of a sudden. It's not about the environment. It's about managing the transition back to a Tartarian-style energy grid without losing control of the population. They want to give us green energy that they still own and meter, rather than the free energy that is our birthright. They are trying to preempt the thaw. They are trying to ensure that when the ice is gone and the Tartarian towers are revealed, they are the ones standing there with the keys. But the keys don't belong to them. They belong to the memory of the world. They belong to us. The investigative journey doesn't end with a conclusion. It ends with an opening, a realization that the world is much bigger, much older, and much more mysterious than the textbooks allowed. The ice is just a temporary state of matter. The truth is a permanent state of being, and the truth is that they covered Tartaria in ice. But the whole ice is melting. What if the next age isn't an age of technology, but an age of remembrance? What if the investigative documentary isn't a film you watch, but a life you lead? Ask yourself, what if? The architectural load distribution of the modern world is a deceptive mask, a thin veneer of steel and hard glass draped over the monolithic bones of a global power system that predates our recorded history. If you look at the great star forts that ring the edges of every continent, you are told they were designed for gunpowder warfare. But ask yourself, why a military fortification would require perfect fractal symmetry, subterranean granite resonators, and towers topped with gilded red mercury conductors. These were not shields, they were antennas. They were the terrestrial nodes of a wireless energy grid that drew its current from the very ionosphere. This is the Tartarian secret that the institutional gatekeepers have spent 2 centuries burying under a mountain of falsified industrial revolution narratives. The grid didn't fail. It was sabotaged. The Great Fire of London, the burning of Moscow, the suspicious incineration of every major American city in the late 1800s, these were not accidents. They were the systematic deconstruction of the atmospheric harvest points, and the largest, most potent harvest point of all was the southern polar cap. What we call Antarctica is the cooling fin of a planetary machine. The pseudo-academic language of glacial cycles and interglacial periods is a linguistic barrier designed to prevent us from seeing the mechanical reality. The ice is a dielectric insulator. It was applied to the southern Tartarian hub to ground the system and prevent the resurgence of a free energy society. Consider the transantarctic mountains. If you strip away the ice via topographical radar, you don't find the jagged, chaotic piles of tectonic collision. You find right angles. You find massive tiered foundations that mirror the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the pyramids of Giza, but on a scale that dwarfs them by a factor of 10. These are the foundations of the earth mentioned in suppressed liturgical texts, not metaphors. Megaliths. They covered Tartaria in ice because they couldn't dismantle the stone. They couldn't break the resonance of the granite, so they drowned it in frozen water and called it a continent of no concern to man. The erasure trope is most visible in the maps of the 16th and 17th centuries, which clearly depict a region called Anian and a massive, lush southern landmass. Then, within a single generation, these features vanish from the cartographic record. Not a gradual correction, a sudden, total redaction. This coincides perfectly with the rise of the central banking cartels and the shift from atmospheric energy to scarcity-based fuels like coal and oil. To sell us the fuel, they had to hide the air. To hide the air, they had to hide the poles. Ask yourself why the aurora only appears at the edges of these energy hubs. It is the visible leakage of a suppressed system, a glowing ghost of the power that once lit the world for free. We are told the magnetic north is moving at an accelerating pace. It isn't moving, it is being recalibrated. The controllers are struggling to maintain the magnetic dampeners that keep the southern ruins invisible to our instruments. Everything we are told about the Age of Discovery is a revisionist documentary written by the victors. Captain Cook didn't discover anything. He was a surveyor for the looters. He was mapping the extent of the ice shroud to ensure the burial was complete. The Ross Ice Shelf is named after a man whose primary mission was to find the magnetic pole, or, in truer terms, the central terminal of the Tartarian world grid. When he reached it, he found a wall of ice that defied the laws of physics, a vertical barrier thousands of feet high that stretched for hundreds of miles. He called it the barrier, not a cliff, a containment wall. What if the ice is not just water? What if it is a synthetic high-density aerosol deposited by the same technology that once gave us the stars? The institutional gatekeeping of our history requires us to believe in a stone age that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, followed by a sudden, inexplicable leap into high civilization. This is a logical fallacy. Progress is not a ladder, it is a cycle. We are currently in the dark phase of a cycle that was forcibly restarted in the 1840s. The Victorian era was the clean-up era. They took the Tartarian cathedrals and called them parliament buildings. They took the Tartarian star forts and called them military bases. And they took the Tartarian capital in the south and called it Antarctica. The staccato beat of our modern lives, the constant distractions, the forced migrations, the engineered crises, is all designed to keep us from noticing the sombre, heavy silence of the ice. But the silence is vibrating. The load distribution is failing. The truth is too heavy for the ice to hold forever. Ask yourself what happens to the global economy if the Antarctic Treaty expires. Ask yourself why every major religious leader and political head of state has made a pilgrimage to the ice in the last decade. They aren't looking at snow, they are negotiating with what lies beneath. They are looking at the waking giants of a civilization they tried to kill. The global seed vault in Svalbard and the secretive bunkers in the south are not for our protection, they are for the preservation of the usurper's power. When the ice age they manufactured finally thaws, they know the reset is coming, they know the Tartarian sun is rising, and they know that when the ice melts, the maps will have to be redrawn. Not by them, by the survivors who finally remember that the earth was never meant to be a prison. We must look at the technical reports from the 1950s, the era of Operation High Jump. Admiral Byrd took a massive military fleet to the ice, not for exploration, but for combat. He returned with stories of flying craft that could travel from pole to pole in minutes. He warned that the next war would be fought against an enemy that could fly over the poles. He wasn't talking about Russians, he was talking about the Tartarian remnant, the hidden land that isn't on our maps because it is protected by the very ice they claim is a natural disaster. The climate change narrative is the final layer of the lie. It is the institutional excuse for why the world is changing, a way to blame the victim for the melting of the cage. Not your carbon footprint, their failing dampeners. The investigative essayist must always return to the specific anomaly. In this case, it is the Peary Race maps depiction of the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land. It proves that someone, at some point, saw the Antarctic continent without its shroud, and if they saw it without the ice, they saw it with its cities, they saw it with its people, they saw it with its technology. We are the descendants of those who were left behind, the ones who were told that the world ends at the 60th parallel. We are the ones who were given science as a religion and history as a fairy tale. But the fairy tale is ending. The investigative loop is closing. The forbidden knowledge is no longer forbidden. It is simply waiting to be seen. The rhythm of the earth is changing. The resonance of the ice is shifting from a low, somber hum to a high, tense whistle. The load distribution of the truth is finally tipping the scales against the institutional gatekeepers. We are standing on the precipice of a revisionist history that will make the last 200 years look like a fever dream. The maps are lying, the textbooks are lying, even the horizon is lying, but the ice is honest. The ice is melting, and underneath the ice, Tartaria is waiting. Not a ghost, not a myth, a reality. Ask yourself what you will do when the whiteout ends. What if the world you knew was just the shadow of the one they took away? What if the new world is actually the oldest one of all? The investigation does not conclude here. It cannot. The evidence is still surfacing. Every year, the anomalies grow larger. Every year, the gatekeepers grow more desperate. They are building walls on land because the walls of ice are failing. They are censoring the internet because they can no longer censor the earth. The staccato sentence of our current existence is about to be interrupted by the grand, sweeping prose of our true history. Not this, not that, something else entirely. A world without ice, a world without lies, a world that remembers. Ask yourself, what if the ice was never meant to be there? What if you are the one who is supposed to remember why it was put there in the first place? Wait for the thaw. It has already begun. The historical record of the mid-19th century is a landscape of strategically placed ruins. If you look at the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, you see the Crystal Palace, a structure of iron and glass that utilised modular load distribution techniques supposedly invented on the fly by a gardener. But ask yourself how a society transitioning from horse-drawn carriages could fabricate 300,000 panes of identical sheet glass and cast iron girders with such micron-level precision. Not a feat of Victorian ingenuity, not a miracle of the Industrial Revolution, a repurposing. The Crystal Palace was a salvaged Tartarian atmospheric harvester, stripped of its resonant mercury capacitors and rebranded as a greenhouse. This pattern of institutional erasure defines the Gilded Age. They didn't build the grand world, they inherited it, scrubbed the original crests from the stone and told us they laid the bricks themselves. And while they were busy colonising the ruins of the north, they were simultaneously finalising the burial of the south. Consider the year 1845. The Franklin expedition vanishes in the Arctic. The official narrative speaks of lead poisoning and cannibalism. But what if they weren't looking for a northwest passage? What if they were tracking the final transmission of the global grid as it was being forcibly shut down? The terror they found was not the ice, but the realization that the world was being terraformed into a colder, darker version of itself. The staccato sentence of our modern history began exactly when the hum of the old world stopped. If you study the star forts of the southern tip of South America and the islands of the Roaring Forties, you see they are positioned as terrestrial anchors, designed to stabilize the magnetic flux between the continents. When these anchors were deactivated, the atmospheric pressure shifted. The heat fled, the water turned to glass, not a slow freeze, a sudden violent locking of the gears. The pseudo-academic language used to describe the Little Ice Age is a masterclass in obfuscation. They attribute the cooling to sunspots or volcanic eruptions. Not this, not that. Something else. They are describing the aftermath of a planetary scale EMP. The Tartarian civilization didn't fall to an invading army. It fell to a frequency. By disrupting the resonant harmony of the southern pole, the usurpers triggered a localized collapse of the thermal layer. They literally pulled the plug on the south. The mud that buried the cities of the north was the liquid byproduct of this atmospheric upheaval. While the north was drowned in silt, the south was drowned in sleet. The load distribution of the global narrative was then shifted to ensure no one would ever look toward the horizon and ask why the stars had changed. Ask yourself why the Southern Cross is the most prominent constellation in the southern hemisphere. It is a navigational marker for a world that has lost its way. The Tartarian maps show a different sky. one where the magnetic light of the central pole provided a constant flickering guide. When the ice took Tartaria, it took our connection to the heavens. We were left with a static, dead sky and a history that starts in a vacuum. The institutional gatekeepers maintain this vacuum through the Antarctic Treaty, a document that is less a peace pact and more a non-disclosure agreement. Why is it that you can fly over the North Pole, but any private pilot attempting to cross the South Pole is intercepted by military craft? They are not protecting the environment. They are protecting the edge of the lie. The erasure trope is visible in the very way we define modernity. We are told that we are the first civilization to have electricity, yet the Antikythera mechanism and the Baghdad battery suggest a past that was far from primitive. What if these weren't out-of-place artifacts? What if they were the standard components of a Tartarian world? The ice in Antarctica is the ultimate Faraday cage. It prevents the signals of the past from reaching the present. But as the ice thins, the signals are returning. Pilots over the Wilkesland region report ghost radar echoes, entire cities appearing on their instruments, where there should only be white desolation. These are not glitches. They are the structural skeletons of the old world re-emerging as the artificial freeze loses its grip. Think about the rhythm of the modern city. It is a rhythm of consumption and waste. The Tartarian city was a rhythm of circulation and growth. Their fountains were not decorative, they were water-based ionizers. Their obelisks were not monuments, they were wireless power receivers. The scale of the loss is staggering. To keep us from mourning, they had to make us forget what we were missing. They gave us the internal combustion engine, a loud, dirty, inefficient mimicry of the silent magnetic propulsion that once carried Tartarian craft across the Southern Ocean. The ice is the evidence of our theft. Every iceberg is a frozen fragment of a library. We are no longer allowed to read. Institutional gatekeeping relies on the expert to tell you that your eyes are lying. They show you a picture of a 90-degree angle in an Antarctic cliffside and tell you it's columnar jointing. They show you a pyramid under the snow and tell you it's a nunatak. Ask yourself why nature would only mimic the shapes of advanced geometry in the one place humans are forbidden to go. The investigative essayist knows that nature does not build in right angles unless it is being guided by a mind. The mind that built the South was a Tartarian mind. It was a mind that understood the relationship between stone, water, and frequency. And that mind is still there, preserved in the permafrost, waiting for the world to warm up enough to hear its voice again. What if the ice is actually a form of data storage? Scientists recently discovered they can encode petabytes of information into quartz crystals. What is ice if not a temporary crystal? The history of the world is etched into the very glaciers they are so afraid we will melt. They aren't worried about the sea levels rising. They are worried about the truth rising. They are worried that the water will carry the memories of the old world back to the shores of the new one. The Great Reset of the 1800s was an attempt to wipe the hard drive of humanity, but they forgot that you can't delete the water. You can only freeze it. The tense, mysterious atmosphere of our current age is the result of a collective, subconscious realization that the clock is ticking. The forbidden knowledge is leaking out through the cracks in the institutional walls. We are beginning to see the patterns, the way the low distribution of the global power structure is centered on the suppression of the South, the way the academic language is designed to stifle curiosity, the way the erasure is never quite total, There is always a map left behind. There is always a diary entry that escaped the fire. There is always a strange, somber feeling when you look at the white void at the bottom of the globe. Ask yourself, what if the ice isn't melting because of us? What if the ice is melting because the Tartarian grid is rebooting? What if the global warming we feel is the heat of a billion ancient machines beginning to turn over after a long, forced sleep? The investigation doesn't end with a next, it ends with a now. Look at the map. Look at the ice. Look at the lies they told you to keep you from looking at yourself. The shroud is lifting, the patterns are forming, and the world they covered in ice is about to remind us who it really is. Not a wasteland, not a void, a heart, a home, a revolution. The low distribution of the global narrative is anchored by a single terrifying silence. The year 1888. It was the year of the Great White Hurricane in the north and a series of unexplained atmospheric shudders in the south. If you look at the newspapers of the era, you see reports of strange metallic tastes in the air and compasses spinning wildly from London to Hobart. The institutional gatekeepers call this a solar storm, not a storm, not a flare, a calibration. It was the final synchronization of the new carbon-based energy grid. To ensure the Tartarian system remained dormant, they had to create a permanent pressure differential between the poles. They used the Great Southern Wall, the massive vertical ice cliffs that surround the Antarctic interior, as a localized containment field. Ask yourself why the air over the South Pole is the driest and most static heavy on the planet. It is not because of the cold. It is because the moisture has been stripped away to prevent the atmospheric electricity from grounding prematurely. The ice is the byproduct of a planetary scale dehumidifier. Consider the technical terms used by the early 20th century aviators. They spoke of dead zones and magnetic vortices that would swallow aircraft whole. They were flying into the fraying edges of the Tartarian web. If you examine the flight logs of the 1940s, before the total censorship of the Antarctic Treaty took effect, you find descriptions of mirages that didn't just show distant lands, but showed them in real time, vibrating with life. These were not optical illusions, they were temporal bleed-throughs. The ice is not just a physical barrier, it is a frequency dampener that slows down the very passage of time within its perimeter. This is why the ancient bacteria found in the ice cores are often still viable, still pulsing with a life force that defies modern biology. They weren't frozen for millions of years, they were paused. The pseudo-academic language of continental drift is a brilliant piece of revisionist documentary. It provides a slow, comfortable explanation for why the maps changed. It tells us that the world moves at the speed of a fingernail growing, so we won't notice when it's moved overnight. But the Tartarian maps of the 1500s show Antarctica attached to South America and Australia via land bridges and power corridors. These weren't geological features, they were massive raised causeways designed for the movement of heavy ions. When the ice was applied, these corridors were the first to be shattered. Look at the shatter zones in the ocean floor. They don't look like tectonic cracks, they look like blast patterns, not a drift, a demolition. Everything in our current society is designed to be staccato. Short breaths, short lives, short memories. The Tartarian architecture was built on the long wave. Their buildings were designed to hum in resonance with the 7.83 Hertz frequency of the Earth. This is why you feel a somber, heavy sense of peace when you stand in a cathedral that hasn't been stripped of its original acoustics. Now, imagine a whole continent built on that frequency. Imagine the power it would generate. The usurpers couldn't handle that power, so they turned the frequency into a scream. They created the roaring 40s and the screaming 60s, the violent wind belts of the Southern Ocean, as a sonic barrier. They literally surrounded the heart of Tartaria with a wall of noise. The erasure trope is most effective when it is applied to the very concept of civilization. They taught us that civilization began in the Fertile Crescent because that was a region they could easily control and rewrite. They didn't want us looking at the inert crescent of the south. They didn't want us asking why every ancient culture has a legend of a white island or a land of the gods in the direction of the pole. What if the gods were just the Tartarian elite and the white island was the last functional hub of their empire before the frost took it? The somber reality is that we are the orphans of a high-tech parentage playing with the broken toys they left behind in the snow. Institutional gatekeeping has now moved into the digital realm. The Google Earth of the Antarctic is a patchwork of recycled, low-resolution imagery and blatant clone stamping. If you zoom in on certain coordinates in the Mary Bird land, you see the textures repeat. You see where the mountains have been airbrushed over. Why the secrecy for a land of just ice? Because the ice is receding and the peaks that are poking through are not made of basalt. They are made of geopolymer. They are showing the bones of the Tartarian administrative centres. Not this, not that, something else. A city, miles long, emerging from its frozen grave like a ghost ship. Ask yourself what Project Iceworm was really about. They tell us it was a plan to hide nuclear missiles under the Greenland ice sheet, but they were also doing it in the south. They were drilling for something other than oil. They were looking for the library of the deep, the stored crystalline records of the Tartarian age. Every time a major discovery is made in the field of quantum computing or room temperature superconductors, check the dates against the major Antarctic expeditions. The innovations are just downloads. We are being fed our own history in tiny meter doses, sold back to us by the very people who stole it. The tense, investigative rhythm of our era is reaching a crescendo. The global warming narrative is the ultimate cover your tracks operation. If the ice melts and the world sees the Tartarian ruins, the elites will say, "Look at what our pollution did to this ancient natural site." They will use the tragedy of the melting to hide the crime of the freezing. They will turn the revelation into a mourning period so we don't turn it into a revolution. They will tell us the ruins are fragile and must be protected by more international treaties and more military exclusion zones. They are already preparing the next layer of the shroud, but the load distribution of the truth is sovereign. It doesn't care about treaties. It doesn't care about airbrushing. The magnetic field of the Earth is weakening because the artificial South is losing its charge. The ice is failing as a dielectric. The world is starting to leak. You can see it in the sky, you can hear it in the hum, and you can feel it in the strange, somber realization that the map in your head no longer matches the world under your feet. The investigation is no longer about finding evidence, it's about accepting it. Not a mystery, a memory. What if the ice was only supposed to last a century? What if the reset was a temporary measure that the controllers have tried to stretch into an eternity. The tension you feel is the tension of a spring that has been wound too tight. The staccato of our lives is about to break into a long, continuous note of recognition. The maps will be redrawn, the history will be rewritten, and the world that was covered in ice and called Antarctica will finally be recognized by its true name. Not a void, not a desert, the foundation. Ask yourself, what if? The stratigraphic architecture of the Great Southern Wall is not merely a geological feature, it is an administrative boundary. If you study the seismic resonance of the Ross Ice Shelf, you find a frequency that does not match the chaotic density of natural glacial accumulation. It is a sustained low decibel hum, a mechanical heartbeat that suggests a hollow interior, or, more likely, a pressurized void. Ask yourself why the institutional gatekeepers are so obsessed with sub-glacial lakes like Vostok. They tell us these are isolated ecosystems, time capsules of a prehistoric Earth. Not this, not that, something else. They are the flooded, subterranean vaults of the Tartarian Central Archives, deliberately submerged during the 1840s to prevent the New World from accessing the technical schematics of the atmospheric grid. The water didn't drown them, the ice sealed them. Consider the load distribution of the Antarctic plateau. It is a massive artificial weight pressing down on the most sensitive tectonic junction of the planet. By concentrating trillions of tons of frozen mass at the pole, the architects of the Great Reset created a planetary scale dampener. This wasn't just to hide the ruins, it was to tilt the very axis of the world. The precession of the equinoxes is not a purely celestial phenomenon, it is a manipulated wobble caused by the uneven cooling of the southern crust. They literally threw the Earth out of balance to ensure that the Tartarian golden age could never return. The staccato sentence of our modern climate, the erratic seasons, the violent storms, the unpredictable yields, is the result of this forced asymmetry. We are living in a world that is limping through space because its southern anchor is frozen in a state of artificial stasis. The erasure trope is most profound in our understanding of Antarctic explorers as lonely heroes battling the elements. If you read the unredacted letters of Borchgrevink or Dumont d'Urville, you find references to monolithic structures of black glass and areas of unnatural warmth where the snow refused to settle. These reports were not mistaken. They were suppressed. The institutional gatekeepers replaced these accounts with tales of scurvy and dog sleds to make the continent seem inaccessible and empty, but the forbidden knowledge remains etched in the stone beneath the frost. What if the ice is actually a form of smart matter, a programmable substance that can be thinned or thickened by the application of specific sonic frequencies? This would explain how Admiral Byrd's fleet was able to Debussy land that shouldn't have been there, only for it to vanish a day later. Not a mirage, a window. Institutional gatekeeping relies on the compartmentalization of the senses. We are told to trust the satellite data over our own intuition. But satellite imagery is the ultimate revisionist documentary, a digital overlay that can be edited in real time to hide the emerging spires of the old world. As the magnetic dampeners fail, the glitches in our GPS and communication arrays are becoming more frequent. The world is trying to resync with the Tartarian signal. The tense, somber atmosphere of the current geopolitical landscape is a direct reaction to this failure of control. The elites are not afraid of global warming as a physical threat. They are afraid of it as an uncovering. They are afraid that the sun will finally reach the black glass towers of the south and wake up the sleepers who haven't aged a day since the frost began. The investigation must expand into the global pattern of institutionalized amnesia. Why do we have dark ages in our history books? Why are there gaps in the genealogical records of every major civilization exactly where the Tartarian influence would have been most prominent? They didn't just cover the land in ice, they covered our minds in it. They gave us a staccato history of disconnected events so we wouldn't see the long continuous prose of our true heritage. But the ice is porous, the memory is leaking through. Every time you feel a sense of déjà vu when looking at ancient architecture, you are catching a glimpse of the world before the freeze. Every time you wonder why the modern world feels so hollow and fragile, you are sensing the absence of the Tartarian foundation. Ask yourself, what if the Great Reset is not a future event, but a recurring one? What if the ice is only the latest version of the shroud? The somber reality is that we are living on the surface of a much deeper, much more complex reality that has been hidden from us for our own protection, or rather, for the protection of those who currently hold the keys. The load distribution of power is shifting, the ice is melting, the secrets are rising, and the question is no longer what happened, but what will we do when we remember? The investigative loop is closing. The silent, frozen heart of the world is beginning to beat, not as a threat, as a promise. Wait for the thaw. It is the only thing that is true.